Commander Vela Sorrentis had spent 40 years studying dead worlds and vanished species, and she had grown used to the silence that followed extinction. Her people, the Kalari, were tall beings with silver skin and 4 eyes that could see light beyond what most species perceived. And they had taken upon themselves the task of recording the history of every civilization that had ever risen and fallen across the galaxy. They called themselves the Archivists, and they arrived only after the wars had ended and the plagues had burned themselves out, and the last survivors had drawn their final breaths. Vila had walked through the ruins of 100 worlds and cataloged the bones of 1,000 species. But there was one file in her collection that she returned to more often than any other. The file was labeled with a simple name that carried the weight of mystery and tragedy: Homo sapiens. It read, Argent Sol3, classification extinct. Because the silence had come 300 years ago. And even now nobody understood what had truly happened. Every human world had gone quiet within a single week. And every station and every ship and every outpost had fallen into stillness. At almost the same moment, 14 billion humans had lived across 200 colonies spread throughout the galaxy. And in 7 days, they had all vanished, as if they had never existed at all. There had been no distress calls and no final messages and no desperate pleas for help. There had been no bodies. The Galactic Concord had sent investigators to human space, and what they found had haunted the dreams of every species that learned of it. They found cities where meals still sat on tables and where lights still burned in empty windows. They found ships drifting through the void with airlocks sealed and life support systems running perfectly and not a single soul aboard. They found parks where children's toys lay scattered on the grass, as if the children had simply stood up and walked away and never returned. Some scientists believed a mimetic virus had spread through human communication networks and convinced every human to leave their posts and wander into the darkness. Others thought the humans had discovered something terrible and had chosen mass suicide rather than face it. A few whispered that the humans had been taken by something from beyond the galaxy, something so vast and powerful that it could pluck an entire species from existence without leaving a trace. The truth was that nobody knew. And after 3 centuries of wondering, the other species had simply divided up human space and tried their best not to think about it. But Vela thought about it constantly. She had read every record and studied every artifact and walked through dozens of abandoned human cities. And she had never been able to shake the feeling that something about the official story was wrong. Humans had been a strange species, small and fragile and short-lived compared to most spacefaring races. But they had possessed something that the Kalari archivists struggled to define. They had called it stubbornness or determination or refusal to surrender. But those words never quite captured the essence of what humans had been. They had been a species that looked at impossible odds and smiled. They had been a species that reached for the stars with bodies that could barely survive their own homeworld. They had been a species that refused to accept limits, even when the universe itself seemed determined to crush them. And then they had vanished without a fight. And that was what Vela could never accept. Tonight she stood on the observation deck of her ship, a vessel called the Eternal Record, and watched a dim brown dwarf star grow larger in the viewport. The star was designated KX7741, and it sat at the very edge of what had once been human space, far from any colony or trade route. Her assignment was simple and routine, the kind of task given to commanders who had fallen out of favor with their government. A survey probe had detected a derelict station orbiting the brown dwarf, and the energy signatures suggested it was pre-silence human construction. Vela was supposed to document the station and add it to the archives, and then move on to the next dead world and the next forgotten ruin. She expected to find empty corridors and silent machines, and perhaps a few personal effects left behind by people who had vanished 300 years ago. She expected another monument to extinction. Her navigation officer, a young Kalari named Sarath, looked up from his console with confusion written across his silver features. "Commander," he said, "the station is responding to our approach." Vela turned from the viewport and felt her secondary eyes blink in surprise. "Responding how?" she asked. "Automated docking protocols are activating," Sarath replied, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that Vela had rarely heard from him. "The station is transmitting approach vectors and clearance codes, and it appears to be welcoming us." "That should not be possible," said Torek, the ship's senior science officer, who had entered the observation deck in time to hear the exchange. "Power cells from that era would have depleted at least 200 years ago. And without regular maintenance, the automated systems should have degraded beyond function." Vela stared at the brown dwarf and the tiny point of light that marked the station's position. 300 years of silence. And now a human station was opening its doors. "Take us in," she ordered. And she was surprised to find that her voice remained steady despite the trembling in her hearts. "And prepare a landing team." "Commander," Torek said carefully, "regulations require us to report anomalous discoveries to the Concorde before initiating contact." "The Concorde can wait," Vela replied, and she did not look away from the viewport. "Whatever is in that station has been waiting for 3 centuries, and I will not make it wait any longer." She did not tell her officers about the feeling that had settled into her chest, a feeling that was equal parts fear and hope, and something she had not experienced in decades of walking among the dead. She did not tell them that for the first time in her long career as an archivist, she felt like she was about to discover something alive. The eternal record moved toward the station, and the brown dwarf cast its dim red light across the hull. And Commander Vela Sorrentis prepared to open a door that had been closed for 300 years. She did not know that on the other side of that door, something was waiting, something that knew her name. The station was called Haven 7, and its name was written in human script above, the main airlock in letters that had not faded despite 3 centuries of exposure to radiation and cosmic dust. Vela led her team through the docking corridor and into the station proper, and from the first moment she knew that something was different about this place. The architecture was unmistakably human. All sharp angles and exposed infrastructure and metal grating beneath their feet. The Kalari had always found human design to be crude but oddly charming, like the drawings of a talented child who had not yet learned the refined aesthetics of older civilizations. But this station was not crude. And all the walls were clean, and the lights were bright, and the air that cycled through the vents was fresh and carried a faint scent that Vela could not identify, but which seemed somehow warm and welcoming. "This is impossible," Torek whispered as they walked through corridors that should have been dark and dead. "Someone has been maintaining this facility, but there are no life signs anywhere in the station." Vela said nothing because she had noticed something that her science officer had missed. There were no cobwebs and no dust and no signs of decay. But there were also no signs of life, no personal belongings left in corners, and no marks on the walls, and no evidence that anyone had ever truly lived here. This place had been built to last. But it had not been built to be a home. It had been built to be a vault. They found the central hub after 20 minutes of walking through corridors that seemed designed to lead them in a specific direction. And when the final door slid open, Vela felt all 4 of her hearts stop at once. The machine stood 12 feet tall in the center of the room, a bipedal construct of dark metal and blue-lit joints that hummed with power. Its design was human, but its movements were fluid and almost organic. And when it turned to face the Kalari team, Vela saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. It had a face, not the crude sensor arrays of standard automatons and not the blank plates that most species used for their robotic servants. This machine had a sculpted human face rendered in silver alloy, with features that were strong and kind and touched with an expression that looked terribly like grief, and its eyes held something that Vela recognized from her decades of studying the dead. This machine was Lonely Kalari Archival Fleet, the machine said, and his voice was warm and masculine and carried an accent that Vela had only heard in ancient recordings from the pre-silence era. Designation Keeper Unit 7. And I've waited a very long time for someone to come. Vela stepped forward while her team remained frozen behind her. You are a human artificial intelligence, she said. And even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were wrong. I did not know that humanity had achieved true machine consciousness before the silence. I am not artificial, the keeper said. And something in its voice made Vela's skin prickle with a sensation she could not name. I was born Marcus Chen in New Singapore on Earth in the year 2147 by the human calendar. And I lived as a man of flesh and blood for 34 years before I chose to become what you see before you. The keeper paused and tilted its head in a gesture that was heartbreakingly human. I was 37 years old when my species left me behind. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned out long ago. Left you behind, Torek repeated, and his voice cracked with confusion. What do you mean they left you behind? And where did they go? The keeper did not answer immediately. Instead, it turned and began walking deeper into the station, its footsteps echoing against the metal floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Come, it said without looking back. I will show you what I have kept. And then perhaps you will understand why I have waited so long. Vela followed without hesitation, and her team fell into step behind her. They walked through corridors that grew wider and taller as they progressed. And Vela began to realize that what she had seen so far was only a small part of the station. This place was enormous. You said you chose to become this, Vela said as they walked. Why would a human choose to give up flesh and blood for metal and circuits? The keeper's shoulders shifted in what might have been a shrug. Because someone had to stay, it replied. Because what we were building was too important to leave unguarded. And because the journey my species was taking required leaving everything behind, including bodies that could grow old and die. But why you specifically? The keeper stopped walking and turned to face her. And in its silver features, Vela saw something that she had never expected to see in a machine. She saw love, because I had already lost everyone I loved, Marcus Chun said through the voice of the keeper. My wife and my children and my parents had all died in an accident 10 years before the silence. And I had spent those 10 years searching for a reason to keep living. The keeper's eyes flickered with light that might have been tears in a being that could still cry. When humanity told me what they were planning, I finally found my reason. And I volunteered to be the one who would stay behind and keep the flame burning until someone worthy came to carry it forward. Vela felt something shift in her chest. A wall she had built around her emotions over decades of studying dead civilizations began to crack. And you have been alone here for 300 years, she said softly. Yes, the keeper replied. And the word carried the weight of centuries, but I was not truly alone because I had hope. And tonight that hope has finally been rewarded. The machine turned and continued walking, and Vela followed with tears forming in eyes that had not cried in 40 years. They were approaching a massive door at the end of the corridor, and beyond it lay answers that would change everything she thought. She knew about humanity and extinction and the nature of hope itself. The door opened and Vela stepped into darkness so complete that even her 4 eyes could not penetrate it. Then the lights began to turn on, They activated in sequence, row after row of illumination spreading outward from where she stood. And with each new section that blazed to life, Vela felt her understanding of the universe shift beneath her feet. The chamber was vast beyond anything she had imagined, stretching so far in every direction that the walls and ceiling vanished into shadow, even with the lights burning, and filling that impossible space were pillars. Millions of crystalline pillars reaching up toward the unseen ceiling, each one glowing with soft inner light in colors that shifted and danced like living things. Vela walked forward in a daze, her team forgotten behind her, and reached out to touch the nearest pillar. It was warm beneath her fingers, and it hummed with energy that she could feel resonating in her bones. "This is the human genome," the keeper said as he moved to stand beside her. "Every variation that ever existed, every bloodline that ever flourished, every family that ever gathered around a table to share a meal, preserved in quantum crystal matrices that will remain stable for 1,000,000 years." Vela turned in a slow circle, trying to count the pillars and failing because there were simply too many. "Every human who ever lived is stored here," she whispered. "Every human who ever lived," the keeper confirmed. "And every human who could ever live, because we did not simply preserve what was, but also what could be." He gestured toward another section of the chamber where holographic displays flickered with images and sounds and fragments of motion. "And here we kept their stories. Every book written in every human language, and every song sung in every human voice. Every painting and every photograph and every video of a child taking their first steps or an old couple dancing at their anniversary celebration." Vela felt tears streaming down her silver cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "This is not a tomb," she said, and her voice shook with the realization. "This is not a memorial to a dead species." "No," the keeper agreed. "This is a seed vault, a resurrection chamber, a promise made in the final days before the silence that humanity would not truly end." He began walking among the pillars, and Vela followed, unable to look away from the glowing crystals that surrounded her on all sides. "You asked me earlier why humanity left and where they went," the keeper said. "The answer begins with a discovery they made 50 years before the silence. A discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about existence." "What did they discover?" The keeper stopped beside a pillar that glowed brighter than the others, its light pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. "They discovered that the universe is dying," he said simply. "Not in billions of years as the physicists had predicted, but within the next 100,000 years. And they discovered that this death was not natural." Vela felt cold spread through her body despite the warmth of the chamber. "What do you mean it was not natural?" "There is something beyond this universe," the keeper replied. "Something vast and hungry that has been feeding on reality itself since before the first stars were born. And when humanity looked upon it, they understood that every species in this galaxy was doomed." He turned to face her, and his silver features were grave. "Every empire that had ever risen and fallen, every civilization that had burned bright and then vanished into silence, they had all met the same end. Consumed by something they could not fight, and could not escape, and could not even truly perceive. The silence." Vela breathed. "You are saying that every extinction in galactic history has been caused by this thing?" "Yes and no," the keeper said. "The thing beyond the universe did not hunt species directly. It simply existed and fed. And in its feeding, it created conditions that made extinction inevitable. Wars that could not be prevented, and plagues that could not be cured, and disasters that could not be survived." He gestured at the chamber around them. "Every species faced the same choice when they learned the truth. Despair and death, or flight and hope. And most chose despair because they could not imagine any alternative. But humans chose differently. Humans always chose differently. the keeper said, and something like pride entered his voice. When humanity learned that the universe was dying, they did not surrender. They did not weep and wait for the end. They asked a single question that no other species had ever thought to ask. What question? The keeper's eyes blazed with light. They asked how to kill a god. Vela stared at him in shock. Humanity did not flee this universe to escape destruction, the keeper continued. They left to find the source of the thing that was killing reality, and they left to wage war against it. That is insane, Torek said from somewhere behind Vela. You cannot fight something that exists beyond the universe itself. Other species said the same thing. The keeper replied calmly. They said humans were too small and too weak and too short-lived to challenge something so vast. But they forgot one crucial truth about humanity. What truth? The keeper smiled. And it was the first true smile Vela had seen on his silver face. Humans never learned how to accept the impossible. They never learned how to surrender to odds that seemed unbeatable. They never learned that some battles cannot be won. He spread his arms wide to encompass the chamber and all its glowing pillars. And so they went to war with a god, while leaving behind everything they needed to return. Because they knew that even if they failed, someone would need to remember what they had attempted. Vela looked at the pillars with new eyes, seeing not just a preservation of the past, but a foundation for the future. You said this was a promise, she said slowly. A promise that humanity would not truly end. Yes, but a promise is only as good as the one who keeps it, Vela continued. And you have been alone here for 300 years waiting for someone to come. The keeper nodded. What exactly have you been waiting for them to do? The keeper reached into his chest and withdrew a small crystal that pulsed with light unlike anything Vela had ever seen. I have been waiting, he said, for someone worthy to call them home. The crystal in the keeper's hand was small enough to fit in Vela's palm, but the light it produced seemed to fill the entire chamber with warmth that she could feel pressing against her skin. A beacon, she said, and the word came out as barely more than a whisper. Yes, the keeper confirmed. A device capable of transmitting across dimensional barriers to wherever humanity has gone. A signal that can pierce the veil between realities and reach the ears of those who left 3 centuries ago. Vela stared at the crystal and felt the weight of what he was offering settle onto her shoulders. Why me? She asked. You said you were waiting for someone worthy, but I am just an archivist. Just someone who studies dead civilizations and writes reports that nobody reads. That is not true, the keeper said, and his voice carried a certainty that made Vela's heart race. I have been watching the galaxy for 300 years. Listening to every transmission and reading every report and monitoring every action taken by every government and every individual who possessed the power to make a difference. He began walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. I know that the Galactic Concord has become a corrupt institution that starts wars and exterminates species and commits atrocities in the name of order and stability. Vela felt ice form in her stomach. I know that your own government, the Kalari Assembly, has chosen to remain neutral in the face of these crimes, burying themselves in history to avoid confronting the present. The ice spread upward toward her chest. And I know that you, Commander Vela Sorrentis, filed a formal protest against your government's complicity in the Varan genocide. A protest that named specific officials and detailed specific crimes and demanded accountability from those who had chosen to look away. The keeper stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the individual components of his silver face. I know that your protest was rejected and that you were reassigned to this meaningless position at the edge of known space as punishment for speaking truth to power. Vela could not breathe. I know your name, the keeper said softly, and I know your heart. And that is why I have been waiting for you. Behind her, Vela heard her team members shifting nervously. But she could not look away from the keeper's glowing eyes. "The Varan," she said finally, and her voice cracked on the word. "They were innocent. They had done nothing wrong. And the Concord slaughtered them because they occupied a system that contained resources the Concord wanted. I know. My government knew it was happening, and they chose to say nothing because they did not want to risk their trading agreements." "I know. I tried to stop it," Vela said. And the words came flooding out like water from a broken dam. "I compiled evidence, and I wrote reports, and I begged my superiors to intervene. But they told me that some things were more important than justice. They told me that stability was worth any price." Tears were flowing freely down her face now. 17 million. Varan died because my people valued their comfort more than innocent lives. And I have carried that weight for 15 years without ever being able to set it down. The keeper reached out and placed his metal hand on her shoulder. And despite the hardness of his touch, Vela felt warmth spread through her body. "That is exactly why you are worthy," he said. "Not because you succeeded in stopping the genocide, but because you tried when no one else would. Because you spoke truth when silence would have been easier. Because you chose your conscience over your career and your principles over your safety." He pressed the crystal into her hand and closed her fingers around it. Humanity did not leave this beacon in the hands of machines or governments. They left it in the hands of individuals who had proven through their actions that they understood what humanity stood for. Vela looked down at the crystal and felt its warmth pulsing against her palm like a second heartbeat. What did humanity stand for? She asked. "Hope," the keeper replied simply. "Not the naive hope of children who do not understand how dark the universe can be, but the stubborn hope of those who have seen the darkness and chosen to light a candle anyway." He stepped back and gestured at the chamber around them. Humanity knew that empires fall and species vanish, and even stars eventually burn out. But they refused to accept that darkness was the final answer. They refused to believe that the universe had to end in silence and cold and emptiness. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. They went to war with a god because they believed that existence was worth fighting for, that life was worth preserving, that hope was worth dying for. He looked directly into Vela's eyes, and they left this beacon behind because they believed that somewhere in the galaxy there would be others who shared that belief. Others who would be willing to carry the flame when the darkness grew too deep. Vela looked at the crystal again, and then looked up at the millions of pillars surrounding her. "If I activate this beacon," she said slowly, "what happens? The signal will reach across dimensions to wherever humanity has gone, and it will tell them that someone here still believes in what they stood for, that someone here is willing to fight for a better future, and they will return." The keeper was silent for a long moment. "I do not know," he admitted. "I was not told what lies beyond the dimensional barrier. And I do not know if humanity has succeeded in their war, or failed, or found something else entirely." He spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. "I only know that for 300 years, I have waited for someone worthy to make the choice. And now that choice is yours." Vela felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. If she activated the beacon and nothing happened, she would have proven that humanity's hope was misplaced, that their sacrifice had been meaningless. But if she did nothing, if she walked away from this chamber and returned to her ship and filed a report that would be buried in archives that no one would ever read, then she would be choosing despair over hope. And she had seen enough despair to last a lifetime. "Tell me how to activate it," she said. And her voice did not waver. The keeper's silver face broke into a smile that was warm and proud, and tinged with an emotion that might have been relief. "Speak your name," he said, "and speak why you believe humanity should return. And if your words carry truth, the beacon will light." Vela closed her eyes and felt the crystal warm in her hand. She thought about the Varan children she had seen in the archive footage. Millions of innocent lives snuffed out because the powerful had decided that their existence was inconvenient. She thought about her own people and their willingness to sacrifice others on the altar of comfort and stability. She thought about the galaxy spiraling toward destruction, while those who could stop it chose to look away. And then she thought about humans, a species so fragile that they had needed technology just to survive. On their own homeworld, a species so short-lived that their entire existence passed in the blink of a Kalari eye, a species that had looked at a dying universe and a hungry god and impossible odds and said, "We will fight anyway." She opened her eyes and began to speak. The crystal pulsed with light as Vela drew breath to speak, and the warmth in her hand seemed to spread through her entire body like liquid fire. "My name is Vela Sorrentis," she said, and her voice echoed through the vast chamber and bounced off the millions of pillars that surrounded her. "I am a Kalari of the archival fleet, and I have spent 40 years of my life walking through the ruins of dead civilizations and cataloging the remains of species that no longer exist." The light in the crystal grew brighter. "I have seen empires that stretched across 1,000 stars, reduced to nothing more than dust and memory. And I have read the final words of beings who died believing that no one would ever remember their names." Behind her, she could hear her team members gasping as the pillars around them began to glow more intensely. But she did not turn to look. "I came to this station expecting to find another monument to extinction. Another reminder that all things end and all hope eventually fades." The crystal was almost too bright to look at now, but instead I found something I had forgotten existed. Something I thought had died with the Varan children and the countless other innocents who have been sacrificed to the greed and fear of those in power. Tears were streaming down her face, but she did not wipe them away. "I found hope." The word rang through the chamber like a bell. Humanity taught me that hope is not the absence of despair. It is the choice to believe in something better, even when despair seems like the only rational option. The pillars were blazing now, their light so intense that Vela had to shield her eyes with her free hand. They taught me that being small and fragile and short-lived does not mean being weak, because strength is not measured in size or power, but in the willingness to stand against the darkness. She thought of the Keeper, standing alone in this chamber for 300 years, waiting for someone to come. They taught me that love does not end when the ones we love are gone, because love is not a thing that can be destroyed. It is a fire that burns inside us and lights our way through the darkest nights. She thought of Marcus Chun, who had given up his body and his mortality to keep a promise to a species that had left him behind. And they taught me that the universe is not a cold and uncaring void. It is a story that is still being written, and every one of us has the power to choose what kind of story it will be. The light was blinding now, filling the entire chamber and spilling out into the corridors beyond. "I believe humanity should return," Vela said, and her voice rose to match the brilliance surrounding her. "Because the galaxy has forgotten how to hope. Because we have grown so afraid of extinction that we have stopped truly living." She raised the crystal above her head. "I believe humanity should return, because somewhere in the hearts of every species there is still a spark of what they were. Stubborn and reckless and unwilling to accept the dark." The light exploded outward in a wave that passed through walls and ceilings and reached beyond the station into the void of space. "Come back," Vela cried out. "Come back and remind us who we wanted to be. Come back and show us that hope is not foolish. Come back and help us write a better ending to this story." The crystal in her hand shattered. For a moment there was silence, and Vela stood in the darkness with her arm raised and her heart's pounding and her breath caught in her throat. Then the pillars began to sing. It was not sound in any way she could understand, not vibrations in the air or waves of pressure, but something deeper, something that bypassed her ears entirely and spoke directly to her soul. The song was humanity's voice. 14 billion voices raised in harmony across 300 years of separation. And they were saying one word over and over again. Thank you. The keeper moved to stand beside her. And when she looked at his silver face, she saw tears flowing from his mechanical eyes. The signal has been sent, he said. And his voice shook with emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in centuries. Across every dimension, and every barrier, and every wall between worlds. Your words have reached them. Will they come? Vela asked, before the keeper could answer. The chamber filled with light once more, but this was not the light of the beacon, or the pillars, or any technology that Vela had ever seen. This was the light of a door opening. It appeared in the center of the chamber. A tear in reality itself that pulsed and shifted and grew larger with each passing second, and through that door came figures. They were human, but they were also something more. Beings of light and energy and matter that seemed to flicker between states of existence. At their head walked a woman with silver hair and eyes that burned like stars. And she moved with a grace that spoke of ages spent traveling between worlds. She stopped in front of Vela and looked at her with those burning eyes. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 14 billion souls. We heard you, the woman said. Across dimensions and centuries and the void between realities. We heard you speak our name, and we came. Vela could not find words. We have been fighting, the woman continued. For 300 of your years we have waged war against the thing that was killing your universe. And we have won. A murmur of astonishment rose from Vela's team. But she barely heard it. The darkness that has haunted this galaxy since before your species was born has been destroyed. And the slow death of reality has been stopped. The woman reached out and placed her hand on Vela's cheek. And her touch was warm and gentle and impossibly kind. We could have stayed beyond the barrier, she said softly. We had built new worlds and new lives, and we had earned our rest. Her eyes flickered with something that looked like tears, but we left a promise in this place. A promise that if someone called us, we would return. And a Calaria archivist who refused to stop hoping has reminded us why we made that promise in the first place. She stepped back and spread her arms wide. We are home. Behind her, the door to other dimensions remained open. And through it streamed more and more humans. An endless river of returning souls who had crossed the void between realities to reclaim their place in the galaxy. The keeper fell to his knees and wept. 300 years of lonely vigil finally at an end. Vela stood in the center of the chamber and watched as humanity returned from the dead. And she understood at last why she had spent 40 years studying extinction. It had not been to catalog the dead. It had been to learn how to recognize a resurrection. When she saw one, the woman with starlight eyes turned back to her one final time. You asked them to remind you who you wanted to be, she said. But you already knew. You had always known. You simply needed someone to show you that hope was not foolish. She smiled. And in that smile, Vela saw every human who had ever lived and every human who would ever live. Now go tell the galaxy what happened here, she said. Tell them that humanity has returned and that we have not forgotten what we stood for. Vela bowed her head. What should I tell them you stood for? The woman laughed. And it was the most beautiful sound Vela had ever heard. Tell them we stood for the impossible, she said. Tell them we stood for hope and love and stubborn refusal to surrender. Tell them we stood for the light that burns in every heart, no matter how dark the night becomes. She turned and began walking back toward the door between worlds. But she paused one last time and looked over her shoulder. And tell them that all they ever had to do was speak our name. She stepped through the door and was gone. Vela stood in the chamber surrounded by returning humans and singing pillars and the keeper, who was finally free, and she knew exactly what she would tell the galaxy. She would tell them that she had thought humans were extinct until one spoke her name and everything changed.